No one paid any attention to the shooting range janitor until a small tattoo revealed a shocking past. To the soldiers, he was just the old janitor, polite, quiet, forgettable, because that ink carried a story that had been buried for decades. The summer sun hung heavy over the military shooting range. Heat shimmered off the gravel paths, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and oil. In the distance, bursts of gunfire echoed in steady rhythm, sharp, controlled, professional. Targets flipped, bullets punched paper, and the instructors barked corrections. Beyond the firing lines, past the rows of sandbags and wooden barriers, stood the gate. It was old, paint faded, hinges worn, but still solid. The man who swept the floors, oiled the locks, checked the perimeter fence. Polite, quiet, forgettable. Every morning, before the first rifle cracked the air, he was already there, unlocking the gate, nodding to the guards, dragging a faded green toolbox from one post to another. If anyone greeted him, he'd smile, a small, tired smile, and answer with a simple, "Morning, son." Never more than that. During breaks, he'd sit under the shade of an old tin-roofed shack, sipping coffee from a battered metal cup. He never joined the soldiers' conversations, never shared stories, never asked questions. It was as if he belonged to the range, but not to the people in it. And so, they didn't pay him much attention. They saw his weathered face, the lines etched deep around his eyes. They noticed the way he walked, slow but steady, like someone carrying old injuries. But they didn't ask. They didn't wonder. Because to them, he was simply there. But there was one thing, one tiny detail that didn't quite fit. Most never noticed it. It hid beneath the rolled-down sleeve of his faded khaki shirt. Only when the wind caught his cuff, or when he reached up to fix a flag on its pole, would you catch a glimpse. A mark, a small tattoo, blurred with age, ink faded to the color of old smoke. No one could make out the shape from a distance. Some thought it was just an old stain, a smudge of grease from his work. But those who caught it in the right light saw something more deliberate, a symbol, strange, precise. He never explained it, and no one dared to ask. Perhaps it was respect. Months into years, until one day, a curious young recruit decided he needed to know. And that, though no one realized it yet, was the day the shooting range would go quiet for a reason none of them could forget. The sun was unforgiving that afternoon. Heat radiated off the shooting range, wrapping every soldier in a blanket of sweat. The sharp crack of rifles filled the air, followed by the dull thud of bullets finding their targets. A group of recruits was taking a short break between drills, helmets off, rifles slung low, wiping their brows. Among them was Private Lewis, fresh out of training camp, 19 years old, bright eyes, always curious about everything and everyone. Lewis had noticed the old gatekeeper before. How could he not? The man was always there, opening the gate, fixing locks, carrying that faded green toolbox like it weighed nothing. But today, something caught Lewis's eye that made him stop mid-sip of water. Mr. Gray was standing near the flagpole, the muscles in his forearm tightening as he worked. And there, on the inside of his arm, just above the wrist, was a mark. A tattoo. Small, faded almost to nothing, but not random. It wasn't the kind of ink you saw from a drunken night in town. It was deliberate, precise. Lewis squinted. From where he stood, he could just make out the outline of a winged emblem. Maybe a number beneath it? It was hard to tell. The lines were blurred, the black ink washed out into a ghostly gray by years and sun and time. Something about it made his pulse quicken. It didn't look decorative. It looked official, military, older than anyone on that range, maybe older than the range itself. Without really thinking, Lewis stepped forward. The chatter around him dimmed in his ears. He walked until he was just a few steps from the old man, who had now lowered his arm and was wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Sir," Lewis began, his voice hesitant. Mr. Gray turned, one eyebrow raised, expression neutral. Lewis pointed, almost awkwardly, toward the tattoo. "That mark on your arm, what does it mean?" The moment hung in the air like a held breath. The old man didn't answer immediately. He glanced down at his arm, as if seeing the tattoo for the first time in years. Then, He looked up at Lewis, which had been straight and rigid, relaxed ever so slightly. "You really want to know, son?" he asked quietly. His voice was low, but it carried, as if it was meant for everyone within earshot. Lewis swallowed and nodded. "Yes, sir." The old man looked away, toward the horizon beyond the berm, where the sun dipped toward the far tree line. He exhaled slowly, a deep, controlled breath that seemed to pull memories from somewhere far away. "This," he said, brushing a finger over the faded lines of the tattoo, "is not just ink." A few of the recruits took a step closer. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the distant gunfire from another lane seemed to pause. "It's a mark," he continued, "given only to those who walked through certain fire. A fire most men never return from." His words were calm, but they carried a strange gravity, the kind that made you straighten your back without realizing it. Lewis noticed, for the first time, that Mr. Gray's hands were not the hands of a janitor. They were scarred in places, the skin rough and worn in patterns that spoke of years gripping tools or weapons. The old man's eyes flicked back to Lewis. "Where I got this, the air was thick with dust and smoke. The ground shook under our boots. And the men beside me, well, not all of them made it home." He stopped there. No details, no names. But the way he said it, soft, steady, unflinching, made the hair on the back of Lewis's neck rise. Someone coughed in the distance. The spell broke for a second, but no one dared to speak over him. Lewis opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could, Mr. Gray rolled his sleeve back down, hiding the tattoo once again. "That's enough for today," he said simply. "Back to your drills." But the range didn't move right away. The recruits stood rooted in place, trading glances, heading toward the far gate like nothing had happened. And yet something had, because now, every time Lewis looked at him, he didn't see the quiet, polite janitor anymore. He saw a man who had been somewhere, done something, survived things that couldn't be put into words. And the others felt it too. From that moment on, the old man was no longer invisible. The shooting range had many sounds: gunfire, shouted orders, clinking shell casings. But that afternoon there was also silence. A heavy, thoughtful silence. The kind that comes when you realize you just glimpsed the edge of a story far bigger than you imagined. They say some stories are never told. Some because they're forgotten, and others because they're forbidden. Mr. Gray's voice was quiet at first, almost as if he wasn't speaking to the recruits, but to ghosts only he could see. "When I was young," he began, "I wore a uniform very different from the one you have on now. I served in a unit that didn't officially exist." The recruits exchanged glances. Lewis leaned in slightly, his attention locked. "It was a small team," the old man continued. "Handpicked. We didn't march in parades. We didn't have our pictures in the papers. We didn't even have our names in the records. Because our missions were not the kind you write down." He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as though reading the past like a map only he could see. "One of those missions," he said, "took us far from home. The kind of place where the air tastes of dust and gunpowder. Where the heat doesn't just burn your skin, it crawls into your bones. We had one objective: bring them back alive. No one needed to ask who them was. Every soldier in earshot knew the weight of those words. It was an extraction," he explained. "Civilians, trapped in the middle of a fight they didn't start. Pinned down in a town no map could name. We had 48 hours to get them out before the enemy closed in." He drew a slow breath. 48 hours became 24, then 12. By the end, we weren't counting hours anymore. We were counting bullets. The range was silent except for his voice. The sound of the wind brushing past the flags overhead seemed louder, as though it might vanish if he pressed too hard. "This mark," he said, "is the only proof we existed. It's not for decoration. It's not for pride. It's a reminder, for those of us who came back, of the ones who didn't. Every man who wore it earned it in blood, and every man who wore it knew the cost." Lewis's throat felt tight. He'd seen men brag about their service before. Medals flashed, stories told loud over drinks. But this was different. This wasn't boasting. This was grief wrapped in steel. "We brought them out," Mr. Gray continued, all 37. Some limped, some had to be carried, but they made it across the line alive. When we handed them over, the higher-ups gave us the same thing they always gave us. He let out a humorless breath, a nod, a handshake, and silence. His eyes drifted to the dirt at his feet. That was the last mission I ever ran. After that, they told me I'd done my part. They sent me home. No medals, no ceremonies, just home. The old man's voice softened, almost to a whisper. I thought I could leave it behind. But the truth is, you don't leave something like that. It follows you. In the sound of gunfire, in the weight of a toolbox. Touching the tattoo once more. It means I was part of something that mattered to people who will never know my name. It means I carry the memory of men who gave everything and got nothing in return but this mark. A long pause followed. Nobody dared to break it. Finally, Mr. Gray rolled his sleeve back down, hiding the ink from view. The mask of the quiet janitor slid back into place. But now, everyone knew it was just a mask. All right, he said, his voice steady again. Break's over. Let's see if any of you can shoot straighter than I could back in the day. The recruits chuckled nervously, but the sound didn't quite reach their eyes. Something had shifted on that range. The old man hadn't just told them a story. He'd given them a glimpse into a place most would never go, and most couldn't survive. As they picked up their rifles, Lewis glanced one last time at Mr. Gray. The man was already walking away, the afternoon sun casting his shadow long across the gravel. And Lewis knew, from that day on, no one would ever look at the shooting range janitor the same way again. When Mr. Gray's voice faded, so did the gunfire. It wasn't planned. No order was given. But one by one, the sharp cracks of rifles outside the shed stopped. The echo died against the hills, leaving only the soft rustle of the wind across the range. Soldiers turned from their lanes. Some still held their rifles, others set them down on the benches. They drifted closer, drawn not by curiosity anymore, but by something deeper. Respect. Recognition. In a place where noise was constant, the quiet felt heavy. Every face was turned toward the old man by the gate. Lewis noticed it first, a tall figure in dress uniform stepping into the open. A senior officer. The kind of man who carried rank in the set of his shoulders, the weight of his gaze. He must have come to inspect the training. Yet here he stood, frozen mid-step. The officer didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He simply watched, listened. Mr. Gray, seeing the growing crowd, shifted uncomfortably. His hand instinctively tugged the sleeve back down, hiding the tattoo. He glanced from one young face to another, and for a brief moment, the quiet janitor returned, the one who swept floors and checked locks. Then, as if deciding there was no point pretending anymore, he gave a small, tired smile. I only did my job, he said, voice steady but soft. Same as you're doing now. The words were simple, almost too simple for the weight they carried. But maybe that was the point. A murmur passed through the gathered soldiers. They weren't murmuring in disbelief. They were murmuring in realization. For months, maybe years, they'd walked past this man without a second thought. He was part of the scenery, like the cracked pavement, the faded sign at the entrance, the smell of oil and gunpowder in the air. He had been invisible because they assumed they already knew his story. But now they knew. They hadn't known anything at all. The officer took a slow step forward. The soldiers instinctively straightened, spines stiff, eyes forward. But the salute didn't go to them. It went to Mr. Gray. The old man blinked. For a second, he looked as though he might wave it off, laugh it away. But instead, he returned the salute. Not crisp, not textbook, just a hand raised with quiet dignity. It was the kind of salute between equals, between soldiers who knew the same weight, even if they'd carried it in different decades. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. That would have felt wrong. Too loud for the moment. Instead, the silence held. It was the silence you hear in a field after the last round is fired. The silence that comes not from peace, but from understanding. Lewis caught himself thinking about the missions Mr. Gray had never described, the ones he would never describe. How many nights had he carried them alone? How many mornings had he unlocked that gate, swept the floors, and said nothing? Mr. Gray lowered his hand and cleared his throat. "Well," he said, the faintest hint of humor in his voice, "if you all keep staring at me like that, I might start thinking I'm important." A few chuckles broke the tension, small, genuine. But no one moved away. "You are important, sir," Lewis said quietly. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Mr. Gray met his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The way you nod when you've heard something true, even if you don't quite believe it yourself. "Remember this," he told the young men and women standing there. "Not every hero you meet will wear medals. Not every story worth knowing will be written down. And sometimes the man sweeping the floor beside you has done more than you could imagine." The officer behind him inclined his head, as if to say, "That's the truth." Then the moment broke. Mr. Gray took a step back toward the gate, his keys jingling softly in his hand. The sound was ordinary, the kind of sound that would fade into the background any other day. But now, it felt like a punctuation mark. The recruits drifted back to their posts. But the rhythm of the range had changed. When the rifles began to fire again, the shots came slower, steadier. There was a different kind of focus in the air, the kind that comes when you've just been reminded why discipline matters, why skill matters, why service matters. From his post, Mr. Gray watched them, not with the critical eye of a commander, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen what they could become and wanted them to get there. The officer gave him one last salute before leaving, a silent promise that this meeting would not be forgotten. Lewis, back at his lane, sighted down his rifle. The target seemed smaller than before, but somehow clearer. He squeezed the trigger. The shot landed dead center. He smiled faintly to himself, thinking of the man at the gate. Not just a janitor, not just a piece of the scenery. A soldier, a survivor, a keeper of stories too heavy for paper. And though the gunfire filled the air again, Lewis knew, somewhere in the quiet between shots, the range would never truly sound the same again. The next morning, everything looked the same. The gate still creaked when it swung open. The gravel still crunched under boots. The smell of oil and gunpowder still hung in the air. And there he was, Mr. Gray, moving through his routine, keys in hand, broom under his arm, face calm, unreadable. If you hadn't been there the day before, you'd think nothing had changed. But for those who had heard his story, who had seen that small, it was out of respect, the kind you feel for someone who's carried something far heavier than you could imagine. He remembered the way Mr. Lewis thought about that often, about how many stories in the world lived and died quietly, because the people who lived them had no interest in fame, because some acts of courage were done for the mission, not for the history books. Mr. Gray never brought it up again. He never hinted at what he'd said. If someone hadn't been there that afternoon, they would have no idea the man who swept shell casings off the floor had once fought in places most would never see. But the soldiers who had been there, they told each other in hushed tones, not as gossip, but as something you pass down the way you might tell a legend by the campfire. A reminder that you can't measure a person's worth by the job they do now, because you don't know what they've already done. The respect showed in small ways. A crisper salute when they passed. A quiet good morning, sir, from people who had never called him sir before. Even the senior officer who'd been there that day stopped by the gate more often, sometimes exchanging only a nod, but a nod heavy with acknowledgement. Mr. Gray took it all with the same quiet manner. He didn't smile more. He didn't act proud. He simply kept doing what he'd always done, opening the range, locking the gates, keeping watch. But Lewis noticed one thing. Some days, when the sun caught the light just right, the old man's sleeve would ride up just enough to show that tattoo. And Lewis could swear, Mr. Gray didn't pull it down quite as quickly as he used to. It wasn't arrogance. It was something else. Maybe acceptance. Maybe the understanding that his story didn't just belong to him anymore. It belonged to the memory of his brothers, the ones who never came home. And in that way, the tattoo wasn't just for him. It was for them. Weeks passed. The range went on with its rhythm. New recruits came in, old ones moved on. But Lewis held the moment like a lantern inside him, lighting the path forward. He knew one day he'd tell his own recruits about the man at the gate, about how he learned, in the middle of a dusty training field, that history isn't just written in books, it's carried in scars, in silence, in the smallest marks inked on skin. Some stories are too important to fade. Some sacrifices too great to be buried under routine. And as long as Lewis was there, he would remember. Not because Mr. Gray wanted recognition, but because the men and women that tattoo represented deserved it. Every single one. A living memorial standing right in front of you. Some heroes never seek recognition, but their stories deserve to be remembered. Share this so they are not forgotten.